Now let's talk about work. Remember, I talked about how after 1840 we begin to see lots of immigration, particularly from Irish and Germany. Well, immigrants tend to be willing to work in worse conditions for less money. And so we're going to see a shift from American workers to immigrant workers right here in the United States. By the 1820s, 90% of America is still rural. People live in the country. Most people who live in the city had their own small shop. There was very little unskilled workers in the city. If you lived in the city, it's probably because you had some skill. You were maybe a shoemaker. That's called a cobbler. Or a barrel maker. That's called a cooper. Or a blacksmith or something. But as our ability to produce in agriculture, as the Industrial Revolution improves farm output, which we'll talk a lot more about later, people begin leaving the farm. The Midwest also is having massive output of agricultural goods. The eastern farms are beginning to be farmed out. And so you have lots of people who no longer have a place on the farm. Their work just simply isn't needed, either because the farm is not as productive as it used to be, or because the new equipment on the farm requires less labor. Well, if you're on a farm and they don't need your work anymore, where do you go? Well, you go to the city. There's two labor systems that dominate at the time. One is where whole families move, get a job in a factory, and all work together. And I mean the whole family. I mean from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent. The other system are the Lowell or Waltham systems. These use young, unmarried women because young, unmarried women don't really have a place on the farm. Most would go to the Lowell factories, and these were textile factories in New England. They would work for a while, and they would either meet someone and marry them while they were there working in the factory in town, or they would return to the farm and get married and become the mother on a farm, which is kind of a legitimate role. Most ended up married, though. This wasn't something you did for a career. This was something you did when you were young to support yourself. In the early days of this system, conditions were not bad. The pay was good, and the owners of these factories saw these young girls who came to work for them as kind of their daughters and did what they could to take care of them, closely supervise them. But that's going to change. Even during the period where they were fairly well treated in the early days of this system, it was a difficult life. Growing up on a farm and then having to go work in a factory is a tough transition. For one thing, on a farm, you didn't have anybody standing over you making you work every second of the day. You had a certain rhythm to the world. Sun up and sundown were really important. The seasons were really important. There were busy times of the year and slow times of the year. By the time you get into the factory, though, somebody is standing over there watching you all the time, making sure you work. Nobody cares about the seasons or the time of day. You need to work your hours, and that's that. You're not outside like you would be on a farm. You're in a factory that probably has little or no windows. It's a much, much different life, and this was difficult for a lot of these girls. Of course, eventually corporations are going to look to make larger and larger profits because that's what corporations do. And they're going to do things like cut wages, lengthen hours, reduce the living conditions, not paint the barracks where the girls live for a few years to save a couple of bucks. By 1834, the Factory Girls Association organizes, this is a union of these Lowell girls, and they protest a 25% pay cut. In 1836, they go on strike over a raise in rent. Both times the girls lose, the owners win. In 1844, Sarah Bagley creates the Female Labor Reform Association, demanding a 10-hour workday. They were working more than that at the time, and a better working environment. By the 1840s, women are leaving the Lowell system and moving into jobs like teaching, domestic service, or desperately finding a husband so they don't have to go to the system because the conditions have become so bad. They are replaced, of course, by immigrants who come in and are willing to work for less money under worse conditions, like I said. The immigrant workforce is easily controlled, poorly paid, horribly treated, unorganized, but very profitable. This is largely Irish. The Irish built the railroads, the canals, the turnpikes. They lived in unhealthy shanties. And of course, there's a great irony here. This was justified as being okay to do to them because, they're a bunch of poor nobodies. And then they come to America, they get treated terrible, they live in these awful conditions, and they don't get paid anything. And then you go, see, we told you they were lowlifes. Well, they're only lowlifes because you treat them like that and they have no other choice. But the Irish were viewed incredibly negatively at the time. A sort of white-on-white racism. The pay shifts. It used to be a daily wage. Every day you got so much. To per piece. So you would get paid for however many units that you produced which was worse for the worker. Factories were large, noisy, dirty, and deadly. There were no workplace protections. There were no rules about what you could and couldn't do in a factory. The average workday was 12 to 14 hours, 6.5 days a week. You would probably get Sunday morning off to go to church, but you were expected to be there Sunday afternoon. Wages were constantly declining, and women and children were paid less than men, and nobody thought twice about it. Artisans, and what I mean by artisans are these skilled people, that guy who was making, the tailor, who's making your clothes by hand as opposed to the factory, the shoemaker, who's making your shoes by hand as opposed to the shoes being made in the factory. They didn't like the factory system. They believed in independent work and handcrafted goods. They rejected capitalism, the idea that there should be this class of owners who simply invest business into a money, and that's where all the profit should go. They thought that was terrible. The artisans created guilds, basically, societies for aid, trade unions. In 1834, they united in the national trades unions, and other industries would follow along. These failed as capitalists, as the owners of the companies, would pass extremely strict laws limiting the rights of trade unions. And hostile courts would ban their actions. Trade unions would try to do things like set a minimum price or establish common hours that all the stores would be open. But of course the capitalists didn't like those things. Legislatures would also reject attempts to limit hours worked. This 40-hour workday we have, work week that we have these days, was inconceivable at the time. Attempts to ban child labor were also ignored by the state legislatures. The Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1842 in Commonwealth v. Hunt declares that unions are legal and strikes are lawful, but this is about the only victory unions have. Women aren't allowed in unions anyway. The 1850s does see women attempt to form their own unions, but these end up being more like mutual aid societies, so if you get sick on the job, everybody might chip in a little bit and try to make sure you still get to eat, that sort of thing. But unions failed because they can't succeed at this time because of immigration and the racism that goes along with that. So, for example, if I unionize, the owner's just going to fire me and replace me with a bunch of immigrants. And because I'm a racist, I don't want the immigrants in my union, so therefore my union is doomed to failure. Because I can always be replaced by people that I think I'm better than, so I won't join my union. So unions at this time don't really gain a foothold, and conditions for workers are terrible.